11th May 2022, 4:10 p.m. locale. Literary analysis of the Divine Comedy, Inferno, by Dante Alighieri. Translations by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Canto 1, stanzas 22, 23, 24, 25. When I beheld him in the desert vast, have pity on me, unto him I cried, whiche'er thou art, or shade or real man. As denote in prior stanza, the suggestion that the notance of the host individual encounter was rather a potential self-perspective that the person that the narrator may have been conflicting with or considering, or a description of interpotential or variated self-perspectives that he saw as applicable to himself. And the desert vast is symbolic of the shared space of emptiness, the shared space of the vast, shared, empty, lone space and near desolation they had encountered upon themselves, with symbolizing the degree at presence to which the idea he was encountering, symbolizing the degree of effectiveness or significance or presence the idea had been at within his mind at the time, or the confrontation with that self-perspective would have felt as though, or also symbol like that, the self-perspective at the time would have felt like it was simply him and that viewership of his circumstance within that position of experiencing at the time. And he also likens, it's also symbolic of the wide range for change, the openness, given its openness of environment within phrasing and understanding. Have pity on me, unto him I cried, whiche'er thou art, or shade or real man. Have pity on me, unto him I cried. His viewing of his circumstance as being symptomatic unto himself, or exerting a level of disassociation from himself and his more joyous or heartened perspective. And his present status within the circumstance he is within, and is allowing himself a level of viewership of the aspects of the circumstance as almost symptomologic onto himself, rather than of his own pathos, of his own natured pathos. He's noting it also reveals an intent to plead with the happening and beckon forth some convincing of allotment of respite for is that's seemingly coming from a position of limited hope or limited positive outlook on his own perceived situation. So less so a resignment onto plight with himself, onto plight to alleviate the plight for situation's alleviation, but rather onto an expression of despair in somewhat of a confrontational manner with himself in the same sense. Whiche'er thou art, the acknowledgement of confirmation of a viewership of self-dissociated form, pathos of self-origin, pathos, life in existentia exerting influence. Or a similar acknowledgement, shade or real man, as is an appreciative statement or appraisal of the viewership, that the reminder of the viewership that confrontation, that acknowledgement of citation of venue, of diminishment or weakness. Can be seen as opportunistic and almost spiritualistic self-guidance placed within existentially perceived existence as it relates to existential perception, or doctrinal holdings, and as well as similarly the viewership of self as an actor, and level, and with some consideration of obligate towards the enactment within perception of self, obligation on self toward enactment, continued function or service, and rather, as well as the notance of self in the sense, in an existential sense, referring to more perception. The self is something confronted with and lived in observance of, as well as with, through, in simultaneity, when engaging in serviced actions to designate function with individualized interest, secondary for those in such as an understanding of those within more committed service designation, and shade, two meanings. An offerance of shelter amidst desert, an offerance of a consistent perspective and relief from ongoing confrontation, and as it may come as a resignation from tasking given context of challenge, or an offerance of peace in time as it pertains to more, an offerance of effort toward peace as it pertains to more. Partied interactive conflictions. And the notance of that aspect of shade with both regards being that it is less, the shelter less, that it is less a welcoming and uplift, a welcoming on and giving and benefiting abode, but rather a more simplistic venue of respite. Conflict is had, conflict or challenge is had, as well as speaking onto the awareness that and the degree of dissatisfaction of position, yet appropriate, yet with some level of appreciative appropriate contentment with the offerings of peace and respite given under severity seen, or for the challenge as appropriate, or for challenge as experience. He answered me, "Not man, man once I was, and both my parents were of Lombardy and Manutans, Mantuans, my country both of them." And this seems to me, this is a writer's individuation of the characteristic representation shown of the seconds in form of second speaker. And a notance of the transition of an affliction or tasking onto an existential aspect within a self. Similarly, it speaks onto a connection and higher obligate service and commitment, and similarly to the commitments that one might ascribe onto their commitments and depth of connection one might ascribe onto a relationship. That perceivably it is an aspect of themselves to become something more, so perceive itself obligate onto that groweth nature, to furtherance of groweth nature, as well as the recognition that the aspect of attainment of highest growth position is inaccessible, is of greater than simplicity and simplicitously accessible. Greater than simply accessible, a requirement or requitant of a deepening of change or a sight onto more principality of perspective towards their capacity for offerance or upholdance, offerance of guide, offerance of support, or upholdance of tasking, as well as as well as the idea of the confliction, as well as to reiterate the relevance of confliction within mortal finalities, and the peace to be had, and that the peace themselves, and almost speaking of a peace unperceived position therein as a state of existential transient of the individual, or living within the existential transience unselfed, with self-recognition as noted by the following lines: both my parents of Lombardy and Manutans, by both country of them, by country both of them, and the notance that the becomings of such is available from humble beginnings, and the presence of taskings, the presence of confliction and challenge towards the existential perspectives, as well as the envisionment of higher functionability, or higher functionable form, whether that be of self or supernatural. Is present throughout all forms of beginnings, and within all states, for consideration or enactment untoward. More simply put, it is a reminder of the relevance of principalities. It is a reminder of the relevance of self-perspective in confrontation and amidst taskments, as well as an iteration onto consolidation of principle, an iteration onto advice of consolidation toward principalities of action, whilst welcoming a degree of individual acceptance for shortcoming in that regard. Within that perceived self-obligate or existential factor of any natural experiencing or challenge. Sub Julio was I born, though it was late, and lived at Rome under the good Augustus, during the time of false and lying gods. He speaks of himself. His Sub Julio is with reference to an offerance of capacitation in both, or with either regard, to Pr0 stationing or benefit or receival, or developed skill in capacitation, and a notance that such a thing had not come before peoples to which the degree of higher transience, of existential continuity, of transferability, of guide on towards higher purposive aspect, or enlightenment in kind. Would have only occurred amongst the societies and peoples within the neared age or near time from the time written. The recent he sees writers ascribing of themselves as being of one of a recent generation, or near a generation of the growings of society towards such capacitation, or the writers is describing such characterization of respondent in that manner. And lived in Rome under the good Augustus. And simultaneously noting a relevance of appreciation for the opportune civility in which they had been blessed to exist within. As well as bringing attention to the perspective that themselves during a time of false and lying gods, then of themselves, they would have had to ascribe learnings or directive to higher teaching through their own tasking and workings, as well as to note the challenges that they would have experienced themselves through, as well as to note that aspect of divinity or aspect of higher in any form, whether that be naturalistic or supernatural, can be mired by manipulation or manipulative intent as enacted, or the human follies. Such as with relevance. They variated degrees of the aspect of the 7 sins as they pertained to life and the status of the average seeked or sought after existence within the age at the time and ages alike. Poet was I, and I sang that just son of Anchises, who came forth from Troy. After that Ilion, the superb, was burned. Characteristic and confirmation of a tasking and an introduction of the role of the writer's perceived role of the bard as an existential, as a placement with an existential service unto an offerance of enlightenment in its transience state, which neither they exist for them, in which they simultaneously can exist not for themselves, exist in service, and have existence for themselves, in serving, being as though poets are tasking, or bards are tasking, is of or teachers are tasking alike, or tellers are tasking, is of a sacred duty to the sustainment, nurturing, perpetuation, preservation and perpetuation, the interpotential aspect of understanding in existentia. And you would note his focus in action was on a character of moral standing, was in focus of tellings of a character of moral standing. So he saw himself as an offerance, an extent. But he'd have noted that the respondent's characterization was an aspect of a telling of a morally high standing. In a city, from within one of the great cities, particularly noting the tasking of adherence onto moral standing within life with veiled temptations, or within a veiled opportune for growth outside of for growth with more obligate function onto interest rather than service. Speaking onto some of the highest morality of character in reference. But after that, forth from Troy, after that Ilion the superb was burned, and the notance of a song in tragedy, an acknowledgement of a sense of fleetingness, of stately transience, relevance to the growings of a people's in viewership, as they would acknowledge the end brought upon one who had been seen as of high caliber within a place of opportune for perpetuation of civilization in a form of cruelty, but in a form that's also referential to the referential and of forgive referential to the crueler aspects of nature born within life trying, while simultaneously with notance for life trying, simultaneously acknowledging an offerance of some forgiveness, of forgivability, a mercied understanding of those who would seek the aggressions or the greeds. Where potentially to unjust extents. And further in direction. Thou, why goest thou back to such annoyance? Why climbest thou not the mount delectable, which is the source of every joy? Why a statement describing an offerance of choice to withhold from a contentment for further seekings, and an inquisition on the potential for beneficence, as it may seem from a position of tumultuous tasking as an intellectual, as a solid seeking, rather than an understanding of enlightenment rather than seeking of enlightenment as its contribution, for its contributions onto an offerant peace, with the conjecture being onto a statement and ascription within such designation of tumultuous tasking is with offerance of a teachings with offerings of provision of securities onto growings. And similarly, it's also interpretable with reference to resignation or with speaking of encouragement or speaking of endurance in the face of sensed or perceived futilities. As well as treatment forth emotive despondence, understandings of unrequitance, as it may be relevant to the pursuits of heart. It is oft easier, it is oft better, it is oft simpler, and can oft be better. But for some, service is a service. There's service and continuance, and their sacrifice. For some, some of their greatest pieces can be found within some aspect of sacrifice. And it is also to note with revelation and or prior acknowledgement of the respondent's characterization being of a self aspect of the speaker at time, to note that some part of themselves is seen by them as perpetually tasked in such a manner for their understandings of how forth they can treat with offerings and guide towards a beneficent purpose, like thin existentia, perceived circumstance. Yes, I'll continue this recording. A lot of time break. 11th May 2022, 4:49 p.m. Canto 1, not sure what stanza number, but continuing from prior recording. Now art thou that Virgilus and that fountain, which spreads abroad so wide a river of speech. I made response to him with bashful forehead. Bashful forehead. A notance of transition from a form of stately despondence or seeming inaction by first introduction of character, being of near horsed on silence, to an acknowledgement of appreciable form onto which character can be aspected through. It comes with limited prior. And as well as it becomes, as is stated, as well as simultaneous, it stands acts as simultaneous commandment onto appreciation or self-recognition, for in which paths have been taken that would be seen as beneficent. As well as a notance of sense of self-contradiction by ascribance of one of a self of a ascribance of any given perception or self-perception onto such a manner. That is too aggrandizing, or aggrandizing beyond aggrandizing within the sense of awareness of unsalience to taskings against mortal. Aspected of a mortal, that can be had by mortal, or perceivedly had, or the limited nature to which mortal handlings can be of offerance. For none can tempt, and none can breach. Immortality of existence and perspective therein can either be of finality or an offerance of the superlatively unseen, or superlatively hymned. Which spreads abroad a reverse page, simultaneously questioning how then they had capacitation toward the aspect they present themselves in, or the aspect of the perspective they see it as of understanding, especially with notance of the meek or weak state of initial perception, as well as a notance of query onto the contradiction between, or query onto the handling or querying onto how the potential for their self-sustaining perspective, or sustainable perspective, and still be within position and withholdence too, immortal tumultuous, immortal tumultuous of, or the same aspect of capacity of limitation of resound, outside, out of the more despondently recognizing, meaning that he perceives of the character, is describing the character in such a way that it gives credence to their ability to represent more joyously. There's also noting and questioning as to how such ability can still be had, as questioning how and why such an ability can still be had, and the person then would make of themselves into position, would enact of themselves through position, in which their display is still with acknowledgement of the venuings and the effectuality the effectings or tellings of the restricting aspects of humanity or human experience. Rather than a remain within more continuous, more present joy, even though the offerance of such is availed to them. Why then would they choose to speak forth on it? Why then would they speak forth to tell of tragedies? If they can sing of the joyous appreciations only, or be of, well, to emphasize back to the main point, task of themselves unto tumultuous, rather than embrace and welcome of others unto existence in the more accessible peace. And the main response then with bashful forehead is simply the writer's acknowledgement of the difference, in short, of perspective at time, or a citation that some degree of bashfulness would have been the deviation between the two positions of self-perspective between speaker and respondent, or experiencer and respondent, narrator and respondent. But they would have been ascribed that as both designations apply to the writer within themselves, to the writer or speaker within themselves at that time. Oh, of the other poets, honour and light. Avail me the long study and great love that have impelled me to explore thy volume. Praising of the existence, offerance of an understanding, while simultaneously critiquing simultaneously critiquing of self-occupation within it entirely, rather than more saintly self-sacrifice. Avail me the great love, a requitement, a requestings, or hope unto the greater peace, unto peace and joy greater. And engagement. While simultaneously noting that he'd have to do so in request, reasserting after the statement of reunification of aspect, or notance of unification of aspect, no clearer notance of relations of aspect between narrator and respondent, onto in which a request for availance, the enactment of reinstating of the self-challenged nature by which that growth, offerance of growth, is emergent toward learner, and similarly, self-offerance speaks onto the self-offerance of peace and love as a perpetual tasking on oneself, a perpetual enactment of one's perceived or self-ascribed higher intent. I think it's a curse I'm referencing honor and light that have impelled me to explore thy volume. That have impelled me to explore thy volume is an notance of appreciation that those things did improve upon him, but primarily it acts as a notation of question as to why one would furtherance of question as to why one would stay inst such tasking and self-withholdance from peace, self-withholdance from the more joyous or the more peaceful or more peacefully gratifyingly peaceful. To seek of a furtherance, understanding in that manner. Or similarly, he questions as to why. It's also a question as to why the mortal aspect of nature would be of to sing and to live and to love, then to experience quieting of song after chorus and passing of the midst, passing of the mid onto the later turmoil that is had within existential, that is had within a sustainment of existential perspective. Why then, he's querying also as to why then such aspect would be a thing of nature if that nature is itself benevolent or of joy and beauty or light. Joy, beauty and love are light. So it is a calling onto further study, a telling, a reminder to study, of task, of the sacred nature and respite to be found in the engagement of service at tasking, and a notance of the challenge of existence, and allowance for complainants, and welcome for complainants onto the existentially diminishing or challenging, whether it be connection, self-perspective, ability for service and availance, challenges to subsistence, and a complaint onto a challenge and availability for an enlightenment or transmittance of an enlightenment to be lost. Thou art my master, and my author thou. Thou art alone the one from whom I took the beautiful style that has done honor to me. An acknowledgement of the viewership of that perspective and that contradiction, and not rather than contradiction, but that interpotentiation of offerance of peace and joyous pathing, while simultaneously venuing toward greater perceived self-obligation and confliction, as well as the notation that with growth itself is on to growing of the challenges, or growing of the awarenesses of the misfortunes, and speaking more and growing of the approach, and with growth into higher beneficence is growth towards the quieting of experiencing after much time in labor, and then relaboring in companioned life or subsistence, then on to peaceful days, quiet in a later stead. And speaks to all these things, to the awareness of all these things with great appreciation as they have been things, that aspects of understanding that gave him a capacity, that gave narrator and respondent capacity to speak. As well as noting, as well as to note and to question the simultaneous imperative towards continuance, both it is an offerance, both it is the appeasement. More simply, it is their statement of a perceived absolution of understanding and perspective that they have or hold. The absolution being the nature that existed and taught them, and the misfortune they see through learnings and that birthed enlightening, be it a thing that they simultaneously cherish, to have some plea, some plight forth, some plight onto the sight of the thing itself. Being of greater salience, being greater assailed than he perceives it present with, than he perceives it as at within their present status. And also simultaneously, and stated as such, stated with that intent, but once again simultaneously inviting question onto a viewership of an absolution, an invitation of complainants onto a viewership of such an absolution, as being an offerance of peace enlightening, as being the offerance of peace enlightening. Whilst simultaneously still being a valiant, an experiencing of a mortal's misfortune, of a mortal's tribulation, of mortal tribulatousness, mortal tribulation. Tribulation and mortality. Or the mortal tribulations. Or the tribulatus mortality. Or the tribulatus mortality. Canto 1 verses 22 to 26. 29. 22 to 29. 29. I wish you well, and I wish you peace.